The morning sun painted the Arizona desert in shades of amber and gold, casting long shadows across the red sandstone cliffs that surrounded the small Apache village of Seyi. 20-year-old Ayana knelt beside the stream that wound through their settlement, her dark hands cupping the cool water as she prepared for the day's gathering expedition. The autumn air carried the scent of sage and juniper, and somewhere in the distance her younger brother Kaya's laughter echoed as he practiced with his bow. "The berries will be ripe on the northern ridge," her grandmother, Nalnish, said in their native tongue, approaching with a woven basket. Her weathered face bore the wisdom of 70 winters, and her eyes held the deep knowledge of one who had seen the world change dramatically. "But stay close to the marked paths, granddaughter. The soldiers have been seen again near Whitewater Creek." Ayana nodded, her stomach tightening at the mention of the cavalry. For months, tension had been building as more settlers moved into their ancestral lands, and the blue-coated soldiers seemed to follow wherever conflict arose. Her father, Nantan, had attended too many councils lately, returning each time with deeper lines etched around his eyes. "I'll take the hidden trail through Owl Canyon," Ayana assured her grandmother, shouldering her gathering basket. "If I see any sign of trouble, I'll return immediately." But as she made her way toward the village edge, the thunderous sound of approaching horses shattered the morning peace. Ayana spun around to see a cloud of dust rising from the southern approach, not the measured pace of a hunting party returning, but the urgent gallop of riders bringing news. Her cousin Mapi burst into the village center, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grave. "Soldiers!" he shouted in Apache, his voice carrying across the settlement. "Captain Morrison's cavalry, 3 hours behind me. They're burning everything in their path." The peaceful morning transformed into controlled chaos. Women began gathering children, while men rushed for their weapons. Ayana's mother, Itzel, appeared at her side, gripping her arm tightly. "We must hide the elders and the little ones in Spider Rock Cave," Itzel said urgently, her usually calm voice strained with fear. "Ayana, help me gather the supplies." As the village mobilized with practiced efficiency, this was not their first time facing such danger. Ayana felt a cold dread settling in her chest. She had heard the stories of other Apache settlements, of families scattered to the winds, of promises broken and treaties ignored. "Where is father?" she asked, helping to load blankets and dried food into leather packs. "With the council, trying to negotiate," her mother replied, but her tone suggested little hope for peaceful resolution. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation and fear. By noon, the cavalry appeared on the horizon, a line of blue uniforms and gleaming weapons that seemed to stretch across the desert floor. Captain Morrison rode at their head, his face shadowed beneath his cavalry hat, his bearing rigid with military authority. Ayana crouched behind a cluster of boulders with the other young people, watching as her father and the village elders walked out to meet the soldiers. The distance was too great to hear words, but the body language told a story of escalating tension. Morrison's gestures were sharp and demanding, while her father's posture remained dignified, but increasingly desperate. Then she saw Morrison's hand move to his sidearm. The first gunshot cracked across the desert like thunder, and Ayana watched in horror as her father stumbled backward. Chaos erupted as more shots followed, and the careful diplomatic meeting devolved into violence. "Run!" Mahbe hissed, grabbing Ayana's arm. "To the caves, now!" But as they turned to flee, more soldiers appeared from behind the red rocks. They had been surrounded. The military operation had been planned with precision, cutting off all escape routes. What followed was a nightmare that would be burned into Ayana's memory forever. Soldiers swept through the village like a prairie fire, destroying everything in their path: the carefully built homes, the stored food for winter, the sacred objects that connected her people to their ancestors, all of it reduced to smoke and ash. Ayana found herself separated from her family in the chaos, running desperately through smoke-filled air as bullets whistled past her head. She could hear her mother calling her name somewhere in the confusion, but the sound grew fainter as she was driven further from the village center. She stumbled and fell behind a large boulder just as a soldier on horseback thundered past, his saber glinting in the harsh afternoon sun. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain he would hear it, but he continued on without noticing her hiding place. As the sun began to set, painting the desert sky in shades of red that seemed to mirror the destruction below, the sounds of violence finally began to fade. Ayana remained frozen behind her boulder, tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks as she listened to her world being torn apart. When darkness finally fell, she crept from her hiding place to find her village completely destroyed. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, her neighbors, her friends, her family. The silence was more deafening than the gunfire had been. In the moonlight, she found her grandmother's body near the stream where they had spoken that morning. Nalnish's face was peaceful, as if she had simply fallen asleep, but the blood on her chest told a different story. Ayana knelt beside her grandmother and wept until no more tears would come, her grief so profound it seemed to hollow out her very soul. She was alone in a way she had never imagined possible, her entire world erased in a single afternoon. As dawn approached, bringing with it the harsh reality of her situation, Ayana made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would not simply lie down and die in this desert. She would survive, and somehow she would make those responsible pay for what they had done. But first, she had to live through the next day. The second day of Ayana's survival began with the cruel realization that the soldiers had poisoned the village well before leaving. She discovered this when she desperately crawled to the water source at first light, her mouth dry as sandpaper, only to find the bodies of dead animals floating in the contaminated water. Captain Morrison had been thorough in his destruction. Not content with simply killing her people, he had ensured that anyone who might have escaped would die slowly in the desert. Ayana's training in desert survival, taught by her grandmother during countless gathering expeditions, became her lifeline. She knew which cacti stored water, which plants could sustain her, and how to find shade during the punishing midday heat. But knowledge and execution were two different things, especially when grief threatened to paralyze her at every turn. The Arizona desert in autumn was unforgiving. Daytime temperatures still soared above 90 degrees, while nights dropped toward freezing. Without proper shelter or supplies, exposure would kill her as surely as a bullet. She spent the morning searching through the rubble of her village, looking for anything useful that the soldiers might have missed. Most of the food stores had been burned, but she managed to find a small water skin that had been kicked under debris, along with a hunting knife that had belonged to her cousin. The knife felt heavy in her hand, not from its weight, but from the memories it carried. Mahpe had been so proud when their uncle gifted it to him on his 16th birthday. Now Mahpe lay cold among the ruins, and his knife was her only protection against the vastness of the desert. By noon, the heat became unbearable. Ayana found shelter in a natural cave formation about a mile from the village ruins, her body already showing signs of dehydration despite her careful rationing of the small amount of water she'd found. As she rested in the shade, she allowed herself to truly absorb the magnitude of her situation. She was alone in hundreds of square miles of desert with minimal supplies and no clear destination. The nearest settlement friendly to Apache people was at least a 3-day journey on foot, assuming she could navigate correctly without landmarks she recognized. But it was during this moment of despair that she heard something that changed everything. The sound of approaching horses. Ayana pressed herself deeper into the cave, her heart racing as the hoofbeats grew closer. Through a crack in the rock, She could see two riders approaching the ruins of her village. One was a cavalry soldier, his blue uniform immediately recognizable. The other was a man in civilian clothes, though his bearing suggested military background. "Looks like Morrison was thorough," the civilian said, his voice carrying clearly in the desert air. His accent was distinctly Eastern, cultured and cold. No witnesses, no complications. The soldier, a sergeant by his stripes, nodded grimly. Captain wanted to be sure. "These Apache have been causing trouble for the mining operations too long." "And the girl?" the civilian asked. "Morrison mentioned one might have escaped." Ayana's blood ran cold. They were looking for her specifically. "Desert will take care of her," the sergeant replied callously. "No water, no food, no shelter. She'll be dead within days." The civilian dismounted and walked among the ruins, his expensive boots crunching on the scattered debris of Ayana's former life. He was a tall man, with graying hair and sharp features, dressed in the fine clothes of someone with significant wealth. "Mr. Caldwell wants this land surveyed within the week," he told the sergeant. "The mineral rights alone will make him one of the richest men in the territory. This little cleanup was necessary for progress." Ayana felt rage building in her chest like a physical heat. Her people hadn't been killed for military reasons or even revenge. They had been murdered for mining claims. Her grandmother, her parents, her entire community had been sacrificed for someone's profit. The two men spent another hour at the site, the civilian making notes in a leather journal while the sergeant kept watch. Finally, they mounted their horses and rode away, heading south toward what Ayana knew was the main settlement of Copper Creek. As their dust cloud disappeared, Ayana emerged from her hiding place with a new sense of purpose. She wasn't just trying to survive anymore. She had a mission. These men had names now: Morrison, Caldwell, and others. They thought the desert would kill her, and their secret would die with her. They were wrong. That evening, as she carefully extracted moisture from barrel cactus flesh, Ayana began to plan. She would need to be smarter than simply trying to reach the distant Apache settlements. She would need to get closer to her enemies, learn their weaknesses, and find a way to expose what they had done. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light for night travel when the temperature became bearable. She would head toward Copper Creek, not to attack blindly, but to gather intelligence. If she was going to honor her dead family, she needed to be strategic. As she prepared for the night journey, she noticed something glinting in the moonlight near where the two riders had stopped. Investigating, she found a silver coin that had apparently fallen from one of their pockets. On one side was the image of an eagle, on the other an inscription, "Caldwell Mining Consortium, 1887. The coin felt like a sign. Her enemies had literally left her a clue, a connection to the larger conspiracy that had destroyed her world. She tucked it carefully into her clothing, the first piece of evidence in what she was beginning to realize would be a long campaign for justice. The desert night was cold and filled with the sounds of nocturnal hunters, coyotes calling to each other across the vastness, the rustle of small creatures moving through the sage, but Ayana no longer felt like prey. Something had crystallized during those hours in the cave, listening to her family's murderers discuss their crime like a business transaction. She was Apache. Her people had survived in this harsh land for generations, adapting and enduring through circumstances that would have broken other nations. She carried that strength in her blood, and now she would need every bit of it. As she walked through the moonlit desert, her footsteps silent on the sand, Ayana began to transform. The frightened girl who had hidden behind boulders was giving way to something harder, more focused. The desert was teaching her lessons her grandmother never could have, lessons about solitude, about inner strength, about the kind of patience that could outlast any enemy. By dawn, she had covered nearly 15 miles, moving steadily toward her destination. Her body ached, and her water was running dangerously low, but her spirit felt stronger than it had since the attack. The girl who had knelt by the stream in her village was gone forever. In her place walked someone new, someone shaped by loss and hardened by purpose, someone who would not rest until justice was served. On the third day, Ayana's transformation from survivor to hunter truly began when she discovered the cavalry outpost hidden in Devil's Canyon, 15 miles south of her destroyed village. She had been tracking the water sources her grandmother had taught her about, following a series of natural springs that formed a lifeline through the desert. It was at the third spring, nestled between towering red rock formations, that she found signs of regular human activity, horse tracks, boot prints, and the remnants of military rations. Following the trail with the patience her father had taught her during hunting expeditions, Ayana climbed to a vantage point overlooking a natural amphitheater in the rocks. Below her, concealed from casual observation, was a temporary military camp. Her heart nearly stopped when she recognized Captain Morrison's distinctive black mustache and rigid posture as he stood near a group of tethered horses. With him were a dozen soldiers and 3 civilians, including the well-dressed man from the previous day, presumably the representative of this Caldwell mining consortium. But what truly captured her attention was the magnificent chestnut stallion, tied slightly apart from the military mounts. Even from her position high above, she could see the quality of the animal. The proud bearing, the fine lines, the expensive tack. This was clearly Morrison's personal horse, a symbol of his authority and pride. As she watched, the group appeared to be planning their next move. Maps were spread on a makeshift table, and she could catch fragments of conversation carried on the desert wind. 3 more Apache camps to the north. Caldwell wants this finished before winter. No survivors this time either. The casual way they discussed the murder of her people sent ice through Ayana's veins. They were planning to repeat what they had done to her village, to destroy more families for the sake of mining profits. That night, as the moon rose full and bright over the desert, Ayana made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She was going to steal Morrison's horse. It wasn't just about transportation, though she desperately needed that. It was about sending a message, about taking something precious from the man who had taken everything from her. In Apache culture, a warrior's horse was an extension of himself. To lose it was a profound humiliation. She spent hours observing the camp's routine from her hidden position. The guards rotated every 2 hours, but there was a 20-minute gap when the night watch changed positions that left the horse picket line temporarily unwatched. The timing would have to be perfect. At precisely 2:40 a.m., Ayana began her descent into the canyon. Every step was calculated, every movement silent. Her feet found purchase on rock faces that would have challenged an experienced climber, but desperation and determination gave her abilities she never knew she possessed. The chestnut stallion sensed her approach before she reached the picket line, his ears pricking forward in alertness. She expected him to whinny and alert the camp, but something in her scent or manner seemed to calm him. Perhaps horses, like people, could sense intentions. "Easy, beautiful one," she whispered in Apache, approaching slowly with her hand extended. "I mean you no harm." The horse allowed her to stroke his neck, and she was amazed by his calm acceptance of her presence. As she worked to untie his lead rope, she discovered something that made her blood run cold. Dried blood on the saddle and bridle. Her people's blood from the massacre 3 days earlier. Rage surged through her, but she forced it down. Anger would make her sloppy, and she needed to be perfect. She had one chance at this. The stallion followed her quietly as she led him away from the camp, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire canyon. Every shadow seemed to hide a guard, every sound threatened discovery. It wasn't until they were a quarter-mile from the camp that she dared to mount the horse. The moment she settled into the saddle, everything changed. The stallion was magnificent, responsive, powerful, eager to run. Together they moved through the moonlit desert like spirits, the horse's hooves finding sure footing on terrain that would have been treacherous for a human on foot. As they rode through the night, Ayana felt a connection forming with the animal. He seemed to understand that this was no ordinary midnight ride, that something significant was happening. His gait was smooth and tireless, eating up the miles between them and Morrison's camp. By dawn, they had covered nearly 30 miles, heading toward the mining settlement of Copper Creek. Ayana's plan was forming as they rode. She would not hide in the wilderness like a hunted animal. She would go directly into the heart of her enemy's territory and make them face the consequences of their actions. But first, she needed to transform herself once again. The blood-stained saddle and bridle were evidence of Morrison's crimes, but they also marked her as a thief if she was caught. Using her hunting knife, she carefully cleaned away the dried blood, her hands shaking with emotion as she worked. The horse stood patiently during this process, occasionally nuzzling her shoulder as if offering comfort. She decided to call him Tsi, after her destroyed village, a reminder of what she had lost and what she was fighting for. As the morning sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Ayana and Sei crested a ridge that gave them their first view of Copper Creek. The settlement sprawled along a dry riverbed, with the dark entrances of mining operations visible in the surrounding hills. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys, and she could see the movement of people and wagons even at this distance. Somewhere in that town were the men responsible for her family's death, living comfortably while her people lay unburied in the desert. But she was no longer the helpless girl who had hidden behind rocks while her world burned. She was mounted on her enemy's finest horse, armed with knowledge of their crimes, and driven by a purpose that burned brighter than the desert sun. Morrison and his conspirators thought they had eliminated all witnesses to their massacre. They thought the desert would claim the one survivor who might have escaped their slaughter. They were about to discover how wrong they were. As Ayana guided Sei down the slope toward Copper Creek, she felt the eyes of her ancestors watching over her. Her grandmother's teachings, her father's wisdom, her people's strength, all of it lived on in her. She was no longer just fighting for survival. She was fighting for justice, riding her enemy's horse into the heart of darkness, carrying the truth of what had been done to her people. The girl who had been left for dead in the desert was gone. In her place rode someone who would not rest until the world knew what Captain Morrison and the Caldwell Mining Consortium had done, and until they paid the price for their crimes. The morning sun cast long shadows across Copper Creek's main street as Ayana rode Sei directly down the center of town, her back straight and her eyes fixed on the largest building at the end of the street, the Caldwell Mining Consortium headquarters. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as townspeople recognized Captain Morrison's distinctive chestnut stallion carrying an Apache rider. Shopkeepers emerged from their doorways, miners paused their morning routines, and children pointed in wonder at the striking figure who seemed to have materialized from their worst nightmares about savage attacks. But Ayana was no savage. She was something far more dangerous, a witness with evidence and the courage to use it. She had spent the dawn hours preparing for this moment, transforming herself once again. Using materials gathered during her desert survival, she had painted traditional Apache symbols on her face, not for war, as the townspeople might assume, but for justice. The markings told the story of her people's connection to this land, their right to exist, and the crimes committed against them. More importantly, she carried proof. In addition to the Caldwell mining coin she had found, she now possessed Morrison's own saddle, marked with his initials and bearing the blood evidence of the massacre. The horse itself was evidence, stolen from under the nose of the U.S. cavalry. As she approached the mining consortium building, she saw movement in the upper windows. Word was spreading quickly through the settlement, and she knew she had only minutes before Morrison and his soldiers would be alerted to her presence. A small crowd had begun to follow her progress down the street, maintaining a respectful distance, but clearly fascinated by the unprecedented sight. Among them, she noticed several men whose faces showed not fear, but guilt, men who had likely participated in or known about the massacre. Ayanna dismounted in front of the consortium building with fluid grace, her movements deliberate and controlled. The morning air carried the sounds of the awakening town, hammers on metal, the creak of wagon wheels, the murmur of nervous voices, but all of it seemed distant compared to the thundering of her own heart. The building's front door opened, and out stepped the well-dressed civilian she had seen at her village ruins. Up close, she could see he was older than she had first thought, perhaps 50, with calculating eyes and the soft hands of a man who had never done physical labor. "Mr. Caldwell, I presume," she said in clear, unaccented English, surprising him with her fluency. His composure slipped for just a moment before reasserting itself. "I'm afraid you have me at a disadvantage, miss." "My name is Ayanna of the Tseyi Apache," she replied, her voice carrying clearly to the growing crowd, "and I have come to discuss your mining operations on my people's land." A murmur ran through the gathered townspeople. This was not the broken, desperate savage they might have expected, but an articulate young woman making legal claims. Several men began to look uncomfortable. "I'm afraid there's been some misunderstanding," Caldwell said smoothly, though his eyes never left Morrison's distinctive saddle. The land in question was legally purchased from the territorial government. All proper procedures were followed. Were those procedures followed before or after Captain Morrison murdered my entire village?" Ayanna asked, her voice remaining calm but carrying enough to reach every ear in the crowd. The effect was electric. Conversation stopped entirely, and the crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Caldwell's face went pale, and she saw several men exchange guilty glances. "That's a very serious accusation, young lady," Caldwell said, his voice tight with controlled anger, "and completely unfounded. Captain Morrison was conducting legitimate military operations against hostile Apache raiders." "Hostile raiders?" Ayanna's voice rose slightly, emotion finally breaking through her controlled facade. "Like my 70-year-old grandmother? Like the children who were shot down while trying to run?" She reached into her clothing and produced the Caldwell mining coin, holding it up where the crowd could see it clearly. "You dropped this at my village, Mr. Caldwell, while you and your sergeant were discussing how the desert would kill the last witness to your massacre." A shocked silence fell over the street. Even the ambient sounds of the town seemed to fade, as everyone present absorbed the implications of her words. But before Caldwell could respond, the thunder of approaching horses announced Morrison's arrival. The captain rode up with 6 soldiers, their weapons at the ready, clearly expecting to find a dangerous Apache raid in progress. Instead, they found one young woman holding court in the middle of their own town, publicly accusing them of murder. Morrison's face cycled through several emotions as he recognized his horse and absorbed the scene before him. Surprise gave way to anger, then to calculation, as he realized the delicate nature of his situation. "That's my horse," he said finally, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. "Yes," Ayanna agreed calmly. "Taken from your camp while you slept, just as easily as you took my family's lives while they tried to negotiate peace." As a growing crowd gathered, Ayanna confronted Captain Morrison with undeniable evidence of his crimes. a blood-stained saddle bearing his initials and his own journal documenting the massacre of her village. His denials fell flat, and the townspeople, shocked and heartbroken, turned against him. Judge Thomas Crawford emerged from the crowd to demand Morrison's arrest, and the soldiers, unwilling to defend a disgraced officer, stood down. What began as a lonely fight for truth ended with Morrison and his accomplice in custody, and Ayanna no longer seen as a fugitive, but as a courageous voice for justice. Though the pain of loss remained, her strength had turned tragedy into a reckoning. 3 days after being left for dead, Ayanna stood as a living testament to her people's memory. She had not only survived, she had changed history. Riding her enemy's horse, she carried the truth into the heart of Copper Creek, and justice followed in her wake.